Hi, I'm James Abbott, professional photographer and photography journalist. In this video tutorial for Wex Photographic, I'm going to show you how to emulate the effect of the Instagram filter Clarendon. So before we get started, I think it's really important that we take a look at a before and after of the genuine effect from the app. So at the top here, we have the Clarendon effect, and then down here, this is the original. So the characteristics I can immediately see is that there is a contrast boost, and it also appears that there's a slight saturation boost at the same time. But even more significant than that, and I think this is going to be a real challenge, is that we have cooled down shadows and also highlights. The midtones have actually remained relatively normal, so you'll see here the skin has maintained a lot of warmth, whereas in the shadows here and here in the field, they've really been cooled down with a touch of blue and also a touch of cyan. What I can also see down here in the highlight areas is that we have a touch of cyan. It's very subtle, but it is also a very important characteristic of this filter. So let's just move over to the original image there. And the first thing that we need to do is crop the image down to a square. Now these days you can upload a landscape or a portrait image to Instagram, but I think to get that real Instagram look, it really does help to crop down to a square just to get that really obvious look and feel. So to activate the crop tool, just hit C on the keyboard and you'll see there that the crop tool becomes active on the tool panel, and whichever crop dimensions you were using last time, they're going to be active. So just go up to this drop down menu in the top left hand corner and select 1:1 square, and then just by moving that around we can change the positioning of that crop tool, and by using these controls here we can make it larger or smaller. So I'm going to kind of really focus in on the crystal ball there, get that central, and then once you're done you can either hit enter on the keyboard or the tick at the top of the Photoshop window. So the first thing that I'm going to do before I start playing with all of the colors and achieving that effect is apply the saturation boost. I want that to be at the bottom of the layer stack because I only want the saturation boost to apply to the underlying image. If I was to do it later on, it would apply to all the other color effects and that would make them way too strong. So go down to the adjustment layer icon, which is a half white, half black circle at the bottom of the layers panel, and select vibrance from the list of options. And then we're just going to take the saturation all the way up to 25. And that is really quite strong, but once we apply all the other effects, it's going to look just right. So next up we are going to apply the contrast. So go down to the adjustment layer icon again, and this time select levels from the list of options, and we're going to drag the black point all the way over to 50, and then the white point we're going to drag that into 240. And the reason that we're using levels to apply the boosting contrast is that we have really nice fine control over the black and white points. As you'll see here in these shadow areas on the hand, they're starting to look more like the genuine Clarendon filter, and it's the fine control of these points that allows you to do that. So with the contrast boosted to this level, it is really quite high. The image has become really quite dark, so we're just going to drag that slider over to about 1.75. So once that's done, we can just click on the cross to close that dialog box down. So the image is a bit small on screen, so I'm just going to hold down Control and 0, and that's going to make it a bit bigger in the Photoshop window. And now let's take a look at the actual color effect itself. This is the tricky part of this effect because we're going to be incorporating a lot of cooler tones while at the same time trying to maintain the natural skin tones of the mid-tone areas. So for this we're going to use a color balance adjustment layer, so go back down to the adjustment layer icon and then select color balance from the list of options. To get started on this one, by default it will open up on midtones, but I'm actually going to take that to shadows because I want the shadows to form the basis of the effect, and then we can look at how we need to adjust the midtones and the highlights afterwards. So with the cyan slider, we're going to drag that over to the left. Here you'll see we have the cyan on the left. If we were to drag it over to the right, we would be adding red. So we're just going to drag that over to the left until the image looks really, really nice and cold. So there, that is a really strong effect. But you'll see in these areas of the field, it's already looking closer to the original. And also the image within the crystal ball is starting to look more like it did. And now let's go over to magenta, and we're just going to drag this slider over to the left because we are adding a small amount of pink. And then finally we're going to add a touch of blue, not too much, into the shadows as well. So there we have a really nice cold base for the image. You'll see these shadows on the hand are looking fairly similar to the real effect, and also, as I said before, the field, these lines here are looking nice and cold. So now let's have a look at the midtones. So with the cyan slider this time, we want to make the skin tones look more natural. So we're going to drag over to the right, and I'm going to take that up to about plus 36. And then with the magenta, I'm going to push that over to about plus 5. So we're actually cooling down the midtones a touch now. And then with the yellow, I'm just going to take that down to minus 10. Again, we're just bringing the skin tones back slightly. And then finally, let's go down to the highlights. And cyan, we're going to take that down to minus 30. With the magenta slider, we're going to take that up just a touch to plus 4 there. And then the yellow slider, we're going to drag it over to the right to add some blue. And we're going to take that up to plus 10. So if we look at the before and after, so there's the before and there's the after, you'll see we're already very, very close to the real effect. So let's just close that window down. And what we need to do now is add the cyan to these highlights. So it's almost like you're just adding a sheet of coolness to the highlights. So for this, we're going to use a curves adjustment layer. So go down to the adjustment layer icon again and select curves from the list of options. And you'll see that there is a drop down menu that's set to RGB by default. And we're going to go down to red. And the reason we're working with red is because if I just drag red over to the left, you'll see we add red to the image. But if I drag it down, we're actually adding cyan. So this is where some magic is going to happen. So we're going to need to add a number of points along the curve, and these points are to make sure that the curve doesn't move anywhere that we don't want it to. So I only want the highlight area to be affected. So add a point at each of the squares here, and then at the top, kind of almost halfway between these 2 points here, add another point there. If you accidentally add a point that you don't want, just left mouse click onto it and drag that off of the curve. And then now to add that cyan to just the highlights, what we're going to do is take that top right hand point in the top right hand corner and just drag that down, and you'll see the output here is changing. So let's drag that down until things look about right. So I think about 226 there. So there you'll see we have just that perfect sheet of cyan affecting the image. But one thing that I can see is that the curve has lifted in this area here. So I'm just going to take that point and just drag it over to the right ever so slightly, just to keep the curve on that original line, because I don't want any red to be spilling in to the highlights. So if we just close down that window there, and we can take a look at the original effect. So there is the original, and there is our mimicked Clarendon effect. And as you'll see, it really is quite close to the real effect. So that is how to emulate the Clarendon Instagram filter in Photoshop.